So I want to talk to you about grief today because all of us experience it and none of us can avoid it. And as a pastor, it's part of my life to walk people through that difficult valley of grief. And I'm sure all of us wish that there was a switch that we could just turn off when the pain is too great, but that's not how grief works because see, grief is not a glitch in the system, it's a part of the journey. It can't be avoided, it can't be bypassed. In fact, grief never comes at a convenient time, and you can't skip it with busy work or spiritual cliches. Grief is real. But the blessing of God's grace in the midst of grief is that while we experience grief, grief is not eternal. And God's not absent in the process. He's most present in our pain. Psalm chapter 30, or the 30th division of the Psalm, verse 5, says, "Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning." The first thing I want you to realize about grief, for those of you that are experiencing it right now or may have experienced it and you're still dealing with the residue of grief in your life, is that grief can't be avoided. It's the cost of loving deeply. Because to grieve is to have loved. Jesus himself will actually grieve at the tomb of Lazarus, and commentators and biblical scholars have all sorts of ideas about why he's grieving at the tomb, but if Jesus doesn't deny his grief, you can't either. In fact, denying grief only deepens the wound. It can't be avoided. But the blessing is that God's grace meets you where sorrow sits. Yeah, I like that. God's grace meets you where sorrow sits. It's just the cost of loving deeply. The second thing I want you to realize about grief is that grief can't be rushed. It moves at the speed of the soul. What do I mean by that? No one's winning any trophies for healing fastest. Because grief isn't linear, it doesn't follow this singular line. Grief loops and spirals, it revisits us unexpectedly. And God doesn't clock our tears, He counts them. He gives us room to feel and to heal. In fact, grace in our deepest grief reminds us, take your time, God's not going anywhere. Can't be rushed, but God's patient love carries us through the process. The third thing that I need you to understand about grief is that grief must be experienced, but it won't last forever. I love that. That grief must be experienced as long as we're in this human journey, but it doesn't last forever. Because grief isn't a grave, it's a valley. It's not a final destination. You're going through grief. And while we experience all of this grief, the reminder from Scripture is that joy comes in the morning. And joy will rise not because sorrow is diminished, but because God sustains us through it. For the believer, while death is difficult, grief is painful, and it's total and terrible and traumatic, it's only temporary. And that God's grace will sustain us through the process. He keeps us even in the midst of our grief. So my question to all of you today, because it's Grace Points, it wouldn't be Grace Points without a question, right? Where in your life are you trying to skip the grieving process instead of inviting God's grace into your grief? I know that you're going through it. I need you to realize you can't avoid it. You can't rush it. We're all going to experience it, but it's temporary. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy, God's great joy, will come in the morning. I pray that you hold on to that and that you're encouraged today. Anyway, looking forward to seeing you next time. This is Grace Points. God bless you.